Have you ever heard a legend whispered so softly that you wonder if it's even real? A tale of brilliance lost in a haze of psychedelic dreams, of a shooting star burning out just as the world began to notice. Today we'll delve journey into the life of Syd Barrett, founder, muse, and, for a brief moment, the brightest creative force behind Pink Floyd. Yet, many who passed him on the streets in his later years had no clue they were walking by a man who changed music forever. Let's step back in time, peel back the layers of myth and memory, and see the very human story behind the icon known as Syd Barrett. Growing up in post-war Britain wasn't easy for anyone, yet there was a peculiar magic in the air of the early 1950s. Children played in neighborhoods still bearing scars from bombings, and families tried to rebuild their lives with hope and imagination. Roger Keith Syd Barrett was born in Cambridge on January 6, 1946. Even as a little boy, he was described as dreamy, easily caught up in the swirl of his own curiosity. Friends and family noticed that Syd had a certain spark. He wasn't just another kid on the block. He heard the world in music, saw it in color, shaped it in paint and words. Back then, no one suspected that the very sensitivity that made him so creative would also make him vulnerable. At that time, the concept of mental health was not widely understood. People often dealt with emotional extremes privately, without help. Growing up, Syd's sense of wonder only intensified. His mind was hungry for stimulation, art, music, poetry. All these passions would guide him down a path both triumphant and tragic. By the time Syd reached his teenage years, the cultural climate in Britain was transforming. Rock and roll was trickling in from across the Atlantic. Rebellious youth was searching for new forms of expression. The Beatles were about to explode onto the scene, but in Cambridge, Syd Barrett and his local buddies were just beginning to dabble in the idea of forming small bands, playing in local halls or at private parties. Music was blossoming into something more experimental, more reflective of the free-spirited vibe sweeping across the UK. Syd stood right at that crossroads. He was an art student, a gifted painter, and by many accounts, someone with a restless imagination. In college, he met people who shared this creative hunger, among them future bandmates who would help shape the early Pink Floyd. In the mid-1960s, swinging London became a hotbed for new sounds and flamboyant fashion. There was an electric current in the air. You could sense it in the clubs, the art galleries, the poetry readings. Bands like the Rolling Stones and The Who were rewriting the rules, and a deeper, more experimental scene was percolating just beneath the mainstream. Psychedelic music sprouted in small underground clubs, places like the UFO Club, where the strobe lights, avant-garde films, and swirling incense created a bizarre and thrilling world. Syd Barrett was a child of that moment, a living embodiment of the psychedelic spirit. He didn't just play guitar, he conjured up entire soundscapes that transported audiences to uncharted realms of the mind. The band that would eventually become Pink Floyd found its origins in that London scene. The lineup in its very early days included various shifting members, but the core, emerging around 1965 to 1966, featured Syd Barrett on guitar and vocals, Roger Waters on bass, Richard Wright on keyboards, and Nick Mason on drums. They weren't household names yet, just a group of eager experimental musicians playing gigs for a small but growing fan base. Syd, though, had a radiant stage presence that mesmerized audiences. He wasn't just strumming chords. He was making his guitar speak, squeal, sing in ways that people had rarely encountered before. He also had an uncanny gift for lyrical composition. Whimsical stories and surreal imagery poured out of him, forming a unique blend of childlike wonder and cosmic reflection. It didn't take long for record companies to take notice. With the release of their first singles, Pink Floyd began inching toward the spotlight. When they set out to record their debut album, The Piper, at the Gates of Dawn, in the early months of 1967, Syd Barrett penned most of the tracks. Influenced by Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, nursery rhymes, space-age fantasies, and the swirling kaleidoscope of LSD-fueled creativity, the songs on this record introduced the world to Barrett's imaginative genius. Titles like Lucifer Sam, Bike, and Interstellar Overdrive offered a trip into the mind of a musician who seemed unbounded by conventional rules. Looking back decades later, critics and fans alike would hail Piper as one of the greatest psychedelic albums of all time, a pioneering statement that crystallized an entire era. At the height of the Summer of Love in 1967, the UK's youth culture was in full bloom. Vibrant clothes, endless experimentation with recreational drugs, and an idealistic sense that music could truly unite everyone. These were the hallmarks of a unique cultural moment. Syd, for better and for worse, embraced that spirit wholeheartedly. LSD, in particular, had become widespread among the artistic communities. This potent psychedelic was believed to open creative doors, to expand consciousness, to unlock hidden corners of the mind. For Syd Barrett, LSD seemed initially to be a wellspring of inspiration, but as history has seen time and again, the same substances that spark genius can also unleash devastating consequences in vulnerable minds. By late 1967, those who knew Syd began noticing alarming changes. He wasn't the same witty, bright, playful young man they had come to love. Syd started to forget lyrics during live shows. Sometimes he stood on stage staring blankly into the crowd, guitar hanging limply at his side. In interviews, he seemed distant, occasionally responding with unrelated or nonsensical answers. His bandmates grew concerned. They tried giving him space, coaxing him gently, eventually even bringing in another guitarist, David Gilmour, an old friend from Cambridge, to cover for Syd during performances. The group believed maybe Syd needed a break or a chance to recharge, but the problems only worsened. Critics in the press picked up on the erratic performances. Fans noticed that the once brilliant frontman seemed lost in a fog. Behind the scenes, things were far more troubling. Syd's mental health was in rapid decline. He would wander off or drift away mid-sentence. There were rumors he was dosing LSD daily or near daily, though nobody can say with certainty what was happening behind closed doors. By early 1968, it became painfully clear that Syd couldn't continue in the same capacity. The band decided, some say heartbreakingly, that they couldn't carry on with him if they were to survive as a cohesive unit. One day, while traveling to a concert, the members simply chose not to pick Syd up. No official explanation, no argument. They just didn't bring him along. In his fragile mental state, Syd might not have fully processed what was happening. Or maybe he did, and it cut him deeper than anyone knew. That silent departure marks one of the most tragic partings in rock history, if only because Barrett was the man who had originally driven Pink Floyd's creative spirit. He was the crazy diamond, blazing with an intensity no one else could touch. For a short while, Syd remained in London, drifting between flats and occasionally turning up to watch Pink Floyd from the sidelines. Friends recall him sometimes sitting in corners, scribbling, painting, or just staring into space with an intensity that felt unsettling. His hair, once so flamboyantly styled, started to appear unkempt. His weight fluctuated. Sometimes he shaved his head or his eyebrows. The unpredictable nature of his appearances made people worry for him. Still, Syd recorded a pair of solo albums, the Madcap Laughs 1970 and Barrett 1970, with help from his friends, including David Gilmour. Those sessions were an emotional roller coaster. One day he'd be responsive and engaged, offering glimpses of that old creative spark. The next he'd be unreachable, silent, or erratic, causing long delays and confusion in the studio. Despite these challenges, the raw, vulnerable quality of his solo work has garnered a cult following. Listeners feel like they're hearing a brilliant mind unravel in real time, with fragile, poetic lyrics hinting at a struggle between imagination and breakdown. As the 1970s progressed, Pink Floyd soared to extraordinary heights, releasing albums like The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, projects laced with references to madness, loss, and the absence of someone who was once their guiding light. In 1975, something haunting occurred in the studio as the band recorded Shine On You Crazy Diamond, a tribute to Syd. A heavy-set man with a shaved head and eyebrows wandered in, carrying a plastic bag. For a few moments, nobody in the band realized who he was. Then, with a jolt of shock, they recognized him. Syd Barrett, transformed almost beyond recognition. Reports say that after some awkward chit-chat, he left. That was the last time the entire band saw him in person. Imagine the emotional weight of that encounter. The man who had essentially birthed their distinctive style now stood in front of them, ghost-like, as they recorded a musical eulogy for his fading brilliance. After that day, Syd slipped away from the music scene altogether. He cut off most ties, retreating back to Cambridge to live in near seclusion. Locals sometimes saw him wandering to the grocery store, wearing shapeless clothes, carrying out ordinary errands. He tended a garden, painted occasionally, and was cared for by his mother. It was a stark contrast to the LSD-laced clubs of London or the stages of Europe where Pink Floyd once blew minds with mesmerizing light shows, and Syd's kaleidoscopic guitar. There's a poignancy to these everyday glimpses of Barrett, an aging man who might hum a melody to himself in the produce aisle, overshadowed by the legend he left behind. For fans and scholars alike, it raises unanswerable questions. What was he thinking during those quiet years? Did he miss music, or did he want to forget all of it? Was he content to live a private life, or was he trapped in a mental labyrinth? One rarely told anecdote from his Cambridge days involves a neighbor who had no clue of Syd's musical past. They only knew him as Roger, the quiet fellow who lived down the street. One afternoon, this neighbor heard a haunting guitar melody wafting from Syd's home. By the time they walked up to the window, though, the music had stopped. The neighbor mentioned it later, and Syd brushed it off, saying something vague about just tuning up the guitar. This story lingers as a reminder that behind those silent days, there might have been moments when the old spark briefly ignited. It's heartbreaking and comforting all at once. Heartbreaking because it implies that he had the capacity to play again, but chose not to share that part of himself with the world. Comforting because maybe in his quiet hours, he found some private solace in the craft that once defined him. For Pink Floyd's fan base, Syd Barrett became a mythic figure, an embodiment of psychedelic idealism gone awry. His face remained on t-shirts, the subject of tribute articles and rumors. Some tried to seek him out in Cambridge, hoping for a chance encounter or a candid photo. In that regard, he was like a modern-day Salinger, a recluse too fragile to be drawn into the spotlight again. Over the years, bits of rumored sightings circulated in fan circles. Syd was seen riding his bicycle or painting watercolors by the river. But the man who had once dazzled the world with surreal lyrics and cosmic guitar lines was now, by all accounts, content to fade into anonymity. Historians and biographers have debated the exact nature of Syd Barrett's mental health issues. Some suggest he suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder exacerbated by heavy LSD use. Others argue that the relentless pressure of fame, combined with his sensitive disposition, led him into a psychological tailspin. There are no definitive answers because, in those days, mental health care was far less advanced than it is now. Syd was never officially diagnosed in a transparent, thorough way. His family shielded him from prying eyes, and he rarely spoke about his condition publicly. For decades, fans and journalists have pored over scraps of interviews or testimonies from friends, trying to piece together how his mind unraveled. Yet the truth remains elusive, locked away in the private world he inhabited. Controversy inevitably followed. Some older fans criticized Pink Floyd for casting Syd aside, essentially cutting him off when he needed help the most. Others argue that the band had no choice. If they hadn't parted ways, Pink Floyd would never have achieved the success that allowed them to record some of the most iconic albums in rock history. The group did pay Syd royalties and attempted to look after him financially. David Gilmour, in particular, stayed in touch for a time, even producing or assisting Syd's solo projects. But the swirl of guilt, regret, and creative necessity left scars. Albums like Wish You Were Here stand as testaments to the complicated feelings the band carried about Syd's downfall. The track Shine on You Crazy Diamond, with its haunting refrain, echoes across generations. Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun. Syd Barrett's reclusiveness also sparked a countercultural fascination that refuses to fade. He became an archetype, a cautionary tale of a genius lost to psychedelics, and a reflection on the fragility of artistic brilliance. The 1960s were often romanticized as a golden age of creativity and free love. But Syd's life was a sobering reminder that not everyone survived that era unscathed. If we listen carefully to stories from those who were around him, they paint a picture of a gentle, deeply creative soul who found stardom and the swirling colors of LSD to be too overwhelming. In a sense, Syd served as a living symbol of the collision between innocent wonder and the harsh glare of fame. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Cambridge's quiet corners remained his sanctuary. Whenever rock historians or journalists arrived, hoping for an elusive interview, they found themselves politely turned away. Sometimes, if they managed to spot Syd in public, he would ignore them or ask to be left alone. It was as if he had built an invisible wall between himself and the rest of the world, a barrier that had long been there, but now was fortified by time and distance. Some locals grew protective of him too, sensing that he deserved the peace he had chosen. Tales of him painting in the garden or strolling aimlessly through the streets became local lore. And as Pink Floyd continued to fill stadiums worldwide, the contrast between their enormous success and Syd's quiet life in Cambridge was impossible to miss. An especially poignant memory from that era comes from one of Syd's acquaintances who recounted a summer afternoon when he appeared at a local gathering unannounced. Despite the crowd's initial surprise, they greeted him warmly, offering him a seat and a cup of tea. He said very little, mostly nodding in response to polite questions. After about half an hour, he slipped away as quietly as he had arrived. Did he come seeking connection or out of curiosity? Was it a fleeting moment of nostalgia for communal life? We may never know. Yet the small kindness of that moment, the gentle acceptance of Syd as he was, stands as a reminder that beneath the legend, beneath the myths and rumors, there was a man who simply craved normalcy, or at the very least, freedom from the demands of stardom. Barrett's artistic inclinations never truly left him. He is said to have continued painting, often finishing a canvas, and then destroying it. Some interpret that destruction as symbolic, a statement that his art was private, not meant for public consumption. Others have speculated that it reflected his unstable mental state. But the result is the same. We're left with precious few glimpses into his creative evolution during those reclusive decades. Rumors persist about stacks of unseen artwork in attics or basements, but nothing definitive has ever surfaced. The same quiet barrier that surrounded Syd also shrouded his art. By the early 2000s, Barrett's health was deteriorating. Decades of retreat from the public eye did not halt the march of time. He reportedly battled various ailments, culminating in pancreatic cancer. The end came quietly on July 7, 2006, when Syd Barrett passed away in his home. The music world mourned, but there was a collective sense that the man known as Syd Barrett had long since departed from public life. His death only confirmed the finality of his withdrawal, leaving behind an enigmatic legacy that resonates through Pink Floyd's discography and the broader canon of rock music. When the news broke, fans around the world held vigils, played his music, and posted tributes online. Pink Floyd's surviving members spoke of their sadness, reiterating how foundational Barrett had been to their band's history and sound. There was grief, of course, but also a sense of respectful farewell. It felt as though the world was saying goodbye not just to Syd Barrett, but to an era of youthful idealism. In the kaleidoscopic imagination of the 1960s, Syd had been a guiding star. Now, with his passing, that period felt even further away, sealed off in the annals of rock history. As time passes, the legend of Syd Barrett remains complicated, layered with reverence, pity, admiration, and curiosity. Some see him as a tragic figure, a cautionary tale of how LSD and fame can decimate a promising genius. Others celebrate him as a visionary who, for a brief shining moment, redefined what music could be. Modern fans listening to The Piper at the Gates of Dawn might be surprised by how fresh and inventive it still sounds. The album stands as a time capsule of Syd's boundless creativity, a testament to what he achieved when his mind was clear, his heart was open, and the possibilities seemed endless. Beyond the obvious musical legacy, Barrett's life story touches on the broader question of how society treats its most sensitive artists. We love brilliance, but we often fail to support those who create it when they show signs of struggle. In Syd's era, mental health care was rudimentary, especially in rock circles. The ethos of sex, drugs, and rock and roll overshadowed any calls for caution or compassion. People didn't fully understand the damage that certain substances could inflict, especially on someone with Syd's delicate mental makeup. This leads us to reflect on how many other potential geniuses lost themselves in that vortex of drugs, pressure, and misguided freedom. A lesser-known fact that offers a glimpse into his character happened during the very early days of Pink Floyd. Syd insisted on being credited for not just playing guitar, but doing unusual things to it. This wasn't just a playful credit line. It reflected how he viewed his instrument. It wasn't merely a tool to strum chords. It was a device for conjuring entire emotional landscapes. This small anecdote, buried in a few interviews, exemplifies his approach to creativity, a boundless curiosity that refused to confine itself to the expected. It also foreshadows the sense that Syd was operating on a different plane of imaginative freedom, one that was both exhilarating and ultimately unsustainable. Another rarely cited moment is from the Madcap Laughs recording sessions, when Syd reportedly stood in the control room for hours, silently replaying one track over and over. He would occasionally make a comment so tangential that the engineers weren't sure if he was describing the music or something else entirely. At one point, he mentioned how the song reminded him of certain colors swirling together, like a painting of the ocean in the sky. The line struck everyone in the room. To them, it sounded like a glimpse into some private vista only Syd could see. They noted it down, but it never made it into any official release or lyric. Stories like these linger in the margins of rock history, highlighting how, for Syd, sound and vision often merged into a single tapestry of perception. As we near the close of this reflection on Syd Barrett, let's remember him not just as a casualty of psychedelic excess or a footnote in Pink Floyd's history, but as a unique voice who helped transform rock music at a pivotal moment. He ushered in a new era of sonic exploration, influencing bands that would continue pushing boundaries long after he bowed out. His approach to songwriting, combining whimsical, almost childlike imagery with sharp, dissonant edges, has echoed in genres as disparate as indie pop, punk, and avant-garde. For all the sadness in his life, there's a spark of joyous invention in his music that persists, undimmed by time. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.